Hello, and thanks for joining the Talking Animals Law and Philosophy series. This is the third event in Easter term. My name is Raphael Fazel, and I am the co-director of the Cambridge Centre for Animal Rights Law. Some of you may be here for the first time, so just a few words on how the Talking Animal series works. We will start with a presentation by our speaker that will last somewhere between sort of 40 and 45 minutes, and we'll then have time for Q&A and discussion. The event will end at 6:30 p.m. UK time if you're joining us from this time zone here. As always, everyone's warmly invited to come in the discussion. Perhaps you'll have comments and questions for our speaker. Please, if you'd like to join the discussion, use the raise hand function, which is at the bottom of your Zoom app. If you click on, I think it's changed a little here. I just downloaded the latest version, but you should find it under React, I think. If you can't find the button, you can also just use the chat. That's fine too. But usually it's nice if people just make their comments directly and ask their questions themselves. Now, until we reach the discussion, I will have all the attendees' microphones on mute. We are recording this presentation, so if you need to leave early or if you'd like to send it to a friend, it will be uploaded in a few days' time to our website and the YouTube channel of the Cambridge Centre for Animal Rights Law. Okay, so I think this is all as far as the format of the talk, and it is now my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Richard Miller. Richard Miller is Professor Emeritus in Pharmacology at Northwestern University in the US. He obtained his PhD from the University of Cambridge here, and then joined the faculty of the University of Chicago before moving to the Department of Pharmacology at Northwestern. He's published over 500 scientific papers and 4 books in the areas of biochemistry, physiology, pharmacology, and neuroscience. His latest book, as some of you may know, is The Rise and Fall of Animal Experimentation, published with Oxford University Press last year. The book looks back over decades of research, examining the use of animals in science and exploring questions like, why do we do it at all? Is it successful? Is it ethical? In his presentation today, he will be exploring these questions with us. So without further ado, I'm now handing over to our speaker. The floor is yours.
Hi. Raphael, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, so I can, and you can see the slides, right?
Yes.
So I just go ahead. Okay. Well, good evening or good afternoon or I suppose good morning in my case to everybody. And I want to thank you very much indeed for inviting me to come and talk to you about this book that I've published, which is about the use of animals in biomedical research, which goes on a lot, of course, as you know, in universities all around the world, and of course, tremendously in pharmaceutical companies. So I would like to start out by just making, all right, why is this not going? Hang on, it's not letting me move my slides over, Raphael. Why would that be?
Maybe if you use the arrows instead of the mouse.
I am doing that, but it's not. Well, let's try this. Okay.
There we go.
That does it. All right, no problem. Yeah, so here, a general statement that I'd like to make is that, you know, by its very nature, most experiments in biomedical research that use animals are very, very cruel to the animals. And when I actually first started my PhD here at Cambridge in the 1970s, I remember going into a laboratory on my very first day and having to kill some rats. And, you know, I found I just couldn't do it, actually. I really couldn't. They all escaped. Actually, my nickname was the rat liberationist. And it took me a while before I could actually do this thing. So I got used to it. I got on with my research, but the feeling about, what I was doing to animals never really went away. And over the years, it got more and more profound, actually. And then, some years ago, I started to think, well, there are an awful lot of assumptions about what we scientists are doing. Whether it's ethical, why are we doing it? Do we really need to do it? So I started to think about those things, and the book is really the result of my thoughts on the matter. So I obviously can't review everything I say in the book, but I'd like to tell you about some of the questions that I asked myself, and I'll give you the answers right off the bat, and I'll talk a little bit about each of these things. So when and where did animal research actually begin? Where do these attitudes come from? And the answer to that is, interestingly, a long, long time ago, in the period that we call classical antiquity. Is animal-based biomedical research effective in achieving its aims? Well, the answer to that is, these days, I would say rarely. I mean, sometimes, and I'll give you one or two fantastic examples where it really is effective, but generally speaking, these days, for reasons which I will explain, it's not that effective, actually. Is it actually ethical? I don't think it is when you think about it very carefully. I came to the conclusion it's not really ethical, actually. And then there's the good news. I mean, do we actually need to do it these days? And the answer is, no, we don't need to do it anymore, because there are now, or I would say increasingly, we don't have to do it anymore, because there are now an enormous number of alternatives based on progress in science with things like stem cells, which I'll tell you a little bit about towards the end of the talk. So that I think the whole conversation about animal research in the not too distant future will actually be moot, because we won't be doing it anymore. So that's a good thing. Okay, so I should also mention that the fact that we do animal research and the kinds of things we do to animals in the West, in Europe and in the Americas, it's not actually inevitable. In Asian countries like India, there's a completely different tradition called ahimsa, which is a philosophy based on non-violence and compassion for all things. Now, I'm sure you'll be quick to point out that places like India today are, fantastic biohubs and do all kinds of research, but that's Western research that we've kind of taken and plonked down in India, along with things like Coca-Cola and Disney and all the other things that we've given them. So, I mean, it's not their actual original tradition. So let's talk a bit about the first question. So where does all this animal research come from? Where do these attitudes come from? Well, science, as you probably know, really started in Greece around the 5th century BCE. And the first person to have a really, large-scale animal research program in the way we would think about it was actually Aristotle, who did a lot of animal experimentation and also wrote about it a great deal. And so it's interesting for us to think about how Aristotle viewed animals. And Aristotle thought that, living things had what we might call a soul, but different living things had a different kind of soul. So plants had what's called a vegetative soul, reproduction, growth. Animals had a sensitive soul, so they could feel things, all right? But it's only humans that had a rational soul. So it's only humans that were able to think rationally. So really, the soul that humans had was qualitatively, not quantitative, but qualitatively different from animals. So humans were sui generis. And, once humans and animals are in different categories, it's very easy to start thinking about absolute ways that you could treat one category and not the other. So these attitudes about animals not being rational were based on things like animals don't have language. That's all. Animals can't laugh is another one. But animals don't have language. That's always been an argument, as you'll see, right down until the 19th century, which gave credence to the idea that animals weren't rational, so they didn't have a proper soul, and so that means we could do all kinds of things to them that we didn't do to humans. Now, these attitudes and Aristotle's work went right through antiquity, right down to near the end of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire fell in 476 CE. And the greatest sort of biomedical researcher in antiquity was a Greek doctor working in Rome in the 2nd and 3rd century CE called Galen. And Galen produced an enormous number of results, experimental results, and writings in the field of medicine and biomedical research. And he actually created what's called the entire corpus of Galenic medicine, which became the standard way of doing medicine, not only in the Roman Empire, but also in the Arab caliphates that abutted Europe, or went right into Spain, actually, of course, at that a little later. Now, one thing that happened, of course, when you get to the 3rd century in Rome is that we got a shift from paganism to this new religion, Christianity. And probably, I mean, really the most influential person at that time who was talking about these things was the great theologian St. Augustine. And hang on a second. And St. Augustine thought about animals, among other things. Is a very great theologian. His writings are wonderful to read, like the City of God, the Confessions, and all his other books. So let me tell you a little bit about one of the things that he said about animals. So he liked to think about this story from the New Testament about Jesus and the Gadarene swine. So Jesus was called upon to meet with a man who was possessed with devils. I mean, he was insane, I suppose we'd say. And so what Jesus did was to cast the devils out of this man into some swine. And then he commanded the swine to run into the Sea of Galilee and drown themselves. So Augustine says, you see, I mean, this shows us that Jesus thought that it was fine to use animals for anything. Their lives weren't valuable compared to those of human beings. And so this was basically the attitude of Christianity, that the real reason that you're here on earth is to prepare yourself for the hereafter. And anything that humans need to do that properly is okay. So this was the kind of argument that Augustine would use vis-a-vis his attitude towards animals. Okay, so one might then ask, well, if we've reached the end of the Roman Empire and the rise of Christianity in the first few centuries CE, what happened after that in science? What were the next developments? And the answer to that is nothing happened. Actually, nothing happened for 1,200 years. That's a ridiculously long period of time. There was no science really at all between the fall of the Roman Empire and around the 16th century. And there are reasons for that, which I won't go into at the moment. But if we want to think about when science started up again, we could go to the 16th century. I don't know if you can, because you're looking at my desktop, and I've got a banner here, whether you can actually see the dates. But the dates at the top of this slide say 1543. And the one on the left, in case you can't see it, is a picture of the book De Revolutionibus by Copernicus, where he said that, you know, the Earth goes around the sun rather than the other way round, which was, of course, scientifically and philosophically a huge big deal. And in the same year, on the right, is the book De Fabrica by the Belgian anatomist Andreas Vesalius, where he produced this fantastically detailed anatomy of human beings. And when he did this, he noticed a lot of things where he started to challenge the ideas that Galen had produced and had been the ideas which everybody believed in for over 1,200 years. So science, modern science, is now starting to take off again in the 16th century. And here, interestingly, we see one of the great successes of animal research, actually, with this gentleman, William Harvey. William Harvey in the early 17th century was a student at Padua in Italy, where he studied medicine, which is where Vesalius was as well, as a matter of fact. And then he went home and said he was wealthy. He set up a research institute in his house in England, where he had an enormous retinue of over 30 kinds of animals. And he did a lot of experiments on these animals. Don't forget, there was no anesthetics in those days. He would just slice them up willy-nilly. And he wrote this book, De Mortu Cordis. And in this book, he described for the first time the circulation of the blood. And this was one of the great successes in the history of physiology. You know, he would, as I say, he would cut up anything he could lay his hands on, including, apparently, his wife's parrot. I don't know what his wife said about that, but he apparently did that. And this result that he got, where he described the physiology of blood circulation, you know, that really hasn't changed very much over the years, and is pretty much these days exactly the same as Harvey said in the 17th century. So this was a big success. So we can't say that horribly cruel animal research never provides important results in medicine, because we can see here with Harvey that it can do that. The question is, does it still do that today? And, you know, how often? We'll come to that in a moment. Now, at the same time as Harvey, we also had changes in our attitude towards animals based on modern philosophy or contemporary philosophy. And the main person here we're interested in is Descartes and Cartesian dualism, which says that, you know, humans and animals are just machines, but that humans, again, are sui generis because they have a soul. Self-reflective soul is a little bit like Aristotle, actually. And so, you know, they are designed by God, whereas animals really are just machines. So that also allows you to do certain things to animals that you wouldn't do to humans. And that was a very important idea. In fact, you know, when I look around at my colleagues today who do biomedical research, they basically think exactly like Descartes did. I think that's very interesting. It hasn't changed very much. When we go a little bit later, we can go to Kant, and this is something Kant said. So far as animals are concerned, we have no direct duties. Animals are not self-conscious. There you are. And they are merely a means to an end, and that end is man. So same old thing. Well, not exactly the same, but very similar. So animals are these machines. They're not conscious. We can do what we like to them. Okay. But were there any people taking the opposite track? I mean, talking for animals? Well, you know, back in ancient times in Greece and Rome, we know people had pets. Particularly popular were these little fluffy white dogs called Maltese dogs. You know, they were very popular. Juvenal, who was the great satirist in Rome, said that he thought that if asked to choose, women in Rome would get rid of their husbands rather than their little dogs. And so we know they were certainly popular. And people like Plutarch, Theophrastus, Porphyry, right back to Pythagoras, who was vegetarian for various reasons, they all spoke about the intelligence of animals and, generally speaking, didn't want to do bad things to them, didn't want to eat them. So there was in antiquity a stream of thinking about animals being intelligent and being worthwhile, which opposed the kind of thinking I've actually been talking about. And then when we get to the 16th century, when science started off again in the modern world, we do have people writing for animals. The first one really, wonderful writer, Montaigne, Michael de Montaigne, who was a great, humanist, essayist, wrote wonderful essays on against cruelty and for animals. And then, a little bit later, there were people like Margaret Cavendish, Mad Madge, as she's known, who was one of the first women to actually publish books under her own name as an author, as a woman, and wrote the world's first science fiction novel, The Blazing World. And she wrote a lot about cruelty to animals. And then we get near our own time. When we get to the 19th century, the 19th century is the time where we start getting all these movements for rights. The anti-slavery movement, women's rights movements, animal rights movements. And it's interesting to me, actually, because a lot of the times it's the same people who are involved in promoting all these different things. It's interesting. And then the very first laws to produce some kind of animal welfare, and here I obviously know less about this than you do, because most of you are lawyers. But the first law was this law known as Martin's Act in 1822. You probably know all about that. And after that, there were, several other laws passed right up to the present day. But this was the sort of breakthrough. But in fact, it wasn't the real breakthrough, because the real breakthrough did come in the 19th century, courtesy of a man called Jeremy Bentham. See, I mean, the argument was still going on about whether animals were rational or not, and whether they could talk and all this kind of thing. But what Bentham did, which was so wonderful, was he completely changed the argument. What Bentham said is the question is not can they reason nor can they talk, but can they suffer? And that, I think, is really the point. Can animals suffer? It's not really, I mean, if you walk down the street and somebody's, you see somebody kicking a dog, or somebody's kicking a dog, you don't start thinking, well, I wonder if this dog is rational or not. What you think about is, this is cruel. The dog's suffering. And that really is the crux of the argument. And that really, I think, changed the whole conversation. And that's a much more modern way of looking at things, and a much better way of looking at things. And we had all these, animal rights movements starting, the Anti-Vivisection Society. I love this particular issue of their journal. You can see the front cover here is illustrated by Walter Crane, who was one of the great illustrators in history. You can see that these poor animals here. Here's this like wicked scientist, right, with his knife, and here's St. George protecting the animals from all this, horrible cruelty. And then, in the 60s, we got the book Animal Liberation by Peter Singer, and so on and so forth, right up to the present day, and the various kinds of animal welfare movements that we have today. Now, in the United States, which I'll mention briefly, they took a long time to produce or to have laws which were for protecting animals. The first one really wasn't until 1966. And this was supposed to afford animals some welfare, some protection. However, I mean, I'm amazed at this. I should point out that it's actually very interesting. According to this law that we have in America, mice, rats, and birds aren't animals, right? They're not animals. I mean, that to me seems completely bonkers, actually. Now, I'm not a lawyer and I don't understand why this law exists, but that is the law in America. And so that means that these days, when we have hundreds of millions of animals being used in biomedical research in universities and in the pharmaceutical industry, if you see this circle here, only this tiny little sliver here are actually protected by the law, because, at least the federal law, because there are different laws in the states, in the individual states. Because virtually all the animals that are used are mice and rats and fish and things like that. So, and they're not protected. So it really, really is kind of incredibly bonkers. So why are there all these hundreds of millions of animals being used these days in the United States and throughout the world for research? Why do we have enormous numbers like this? I mean, in William Harvey's time, there was just a few gentlemen around who had the money to do these things. So why are we doing it on such a gigantic scale? So I'll tell you about what happens in America, and similar things happened in other countries actually. So before the Second World War, the government wasn't really in the business of funding research very much. It didn't do that. You could get sometimes research funded if you're working in university by working with a company or something like that. But there was this man called Vannevar Bush, and during the Second World War, he got quite a few universities to sign up to produce, to help with programs that were helping the United States and Europe in the war. And he noticed that these were very successful. So he decided, well, after the war, that the government should get really into the business of funding research in the universities. And if you see the green line here, and this is way out of date, but I assure you it's continued at an ever increasing rate. The amount of money that the government puts into biomedical research is now astronomically high. So the universities were the recipients of all this, financial largesse, and they started to employ lots of scientists. So it became like a job, right, that lots of people had in universities to be a researcher. I mean, research universities actually didn't begin until the 19th century in Germany, when they were invented by William von Humboldt. So they're not all that old as an institution. I mean, research universities where you do research as well as teaching. So the universities after the Second World War started to get all this money and employ lots more faculty members to do science. And all these faculty members started using all these animals, right? And to go along with that, we had a lot more scientific journals to actually publish all the results that were being produced by all these scientists that were using all these animals and doing all these experiments. Now, the fact is that most of these scientific journals aren't very good. In fact, most of them are pretty terrible. And most of the papers published in them are pretty awful and really don't say very much about anything. And in fact, the truth of the matter is that most of these papers in biomedical research published in all these journals are never read by anybody except for the people that publish them, and maybe their auntie or something like that. So they don't really get you anywhere, and they're really for doing things like getting grants and for getting tenure at universities, and they've got really nothing to do with promoting science at all. So here's an interesting comment by the editor of The Lancet. The Lancet is a British medical journal, and it is actually at the moment the #1 most has the highest impact factor. You can obviously guess what that is, of any journal in the world. And here's what the editor of The Lancet said. He says, the case against science is straightforward. Much of the scientific literature, perhaps half, may simply be untrue. Afflicted by studies with small sample sizes, tiny effects, invalid analyses, flagrant conflict of interest, together with an obsession for pursuing fashionable trends of dubious importance, science has taken a turn towards the darkness. And so, that says a lot, I think, about the value of the research that's being performed on the very cruel research, I should add, that's being performed on millions and millions of animals all over the world. It isn't William Harvey research. It's actually, generally speaking, not very useful at all. I mean, in the pharmacology department where I'm in, we have a joke, actually. Ready for a joke? Here it is. Asked to define a drug, which is what we do research on in pharmacology. A drug is a substance which, when injected into a mouse, generates a publication. Well, I mean, there is unfortunately a lot of truth to that, I would say. So why is so much of this research not very valuable? Well, most of it, as I said, is done on animals. So the animals are models. They're supposed to be models for human beings, because it's considered that you can't do a lot of things to human beings because it isn't ethical. You use mice, for example, as models for human beings. Now, it's interesting to remember what the statistician George Box said. He said, all models are wrong, but some are useful. So how useful are these animal models of human beings? The answer is, in the main, not very useful. I mean, the problem is really this, is when scientists think about a mouse, they think about it as being some kind of inadequate version of a human being, right? That it's a tiny human being, but it isn't really very good at being a human being. And there are obviously some similarities between a mouse and a human being, but increasingly we understand less and less. And in fact, this is not really the right way to think about a mouse when you think about it as a model for a human being. And as I say, it's not really a very adequate model. Here's another quote that I like. Animals are not brethren. They are not underlings. They are other nations caught with ourselves in the net of life and time, fellow prisoners of the splendor and travail of the earth. Animals are their own thing. You know, they have their own type of consciousness. It's not necessarily human consciousness, and they don't necessarily work in the same way as human beings do. This man, Jakob von Uexküll, developed a concept called the Umwelt, which is an interesting one. I mean, let's say you're sitting in a room and you see colors, you smell smells, and you hear things. That is the sensory information that goes into your brain, and your brain works on this and helps to produce your conscious experience. But if you're a mouse or a dog sitting in the same room as you are, the sensory apparatus, like the receptors for smell, the receptors for light, touch, all these other things in these animals are not exactly the same as they are in humans. So the sensory information that they receive is simply not the same. And so they can't possibly have the same kind of mental or many other processes as a human being does. I mean, they do sometimes, you know, a bit, but generally speaking, not so much. And so if you want to understand how a dog works, you kind of have to be able to think like a dog. And, you know, we can't really do that. So really, I mean, animal experimentation doesn't work very well because animals are not very good models of human beings when you come right down to the nitty-gritty. They just aren't. And it's very hard to translate animal results in biomedical research to human beings. I mean, you can sometimes, but when faced with this like tsunami of research and this tsunami of experiments that use animals, these days, most of it simply doesn't do that. So I would say that most of the research we're doing on animals today simply isn't very helpful at all. Really, we would say that the proper study of mankind is man, not animals. But, you know, we haven't been able to do that until now. So what changed? Well, what changed is this. We have to go back to the 19th century to look at this man, Ernst Haeckel. Now, Ernst Haeckel was a student in Johannes Muller's laboratory, which is the foremost laboratory of its day, for biomedical research in Berlin in the 1900s. Many great thinkers came out of that laboratory. And he became very interested in evolution, and he was a great follower of Darwin. He met Darwin, and they discussed a lot of things together. He's the one actually who started to draw evolution like a tree. Well, you've probably seen these trees, you know, with humans at the top and all these branches, and the branch with monkeys on it is very near the top, and the one with, you know, bacteria in it is very near the bottom. So this is a pictorial representation of evolution leading up to man at the very top. And that idea, that was first designed by Haeckel, but Haeckel had another idea, and he thought, well, when you look at a single organism like a man or a mouse, the tissues of that animal, as they develop, also you can look at them in the form of a tree. And at the bottom of that tree is a kind of cell. So there's a cell at the bottom of the tree of development of an organism, which gives rise to all the other cells in that organism. And he said, well, I'm going to give that cell a name. And he called it a Stammzelle, or stem cell. So stem cell is a cell in an organism where the organism starts out. I mean, frequently it's a fertilized egg, right? But whatever it is, it can then go on to produce all the tissues of the mature organism. That's the stem cell. So it has this potential to grow any tissue in an animal. So a human stem cell, you can take it, and if you put the right things on it and treat it the right way, it will turn into whatever human tissue you like. Now, that was a theoretical idea. It didn't really get going from the scientific point of view until, you know, a few decades ago, when we got more sophisticated science, and we could start to isolate human stem cells as well as stem cells from animals and change them into different tissues. So you take a human stem cell and you can make, you know, muscles or fat or brain or whatever you like out of it, but human ones, not mouse ones. The other thing I should mention is that all stem cells are taken from individual humans. So, you know, I could get a Richard Miller stem cell or Raphael's stem cell. And the tissues that you make from that stem cell are representative of that human being. So if you use stem cell technology, instead of using a mouse, which is supposed to represent all humans, every stem cell and the tissues that you produce from it is representative of every individual human being. So this is really the start of individual human medicine, right? As opposed to mice, which are just sort of an inadequate average of all human beings. And if you take a stem cell and you treat it properly, you can, in culture, in vitro, turn that stem cell into a complete tissue. So on the left here, you see a stem cell that's been turned into a human stem cell that's been turned into a kidney. On the right, into a brain. And then you can take all these artificial organs that you've generated, and they're called, by the way, I should say, they're called organoids, right? The stem cell can make tissues, it can make organoids. And then you can take organoids and you can join these organoids up to each other and make what we would call assembloids. So gradually from a stem cell, you can grow tissues, you can start linking them together, and you can start to build up from the bottom up an entire organism, like an entire human, although that hasn't been done. But what has been done is this. You can take a human stem cell and you can make a human embryo. And this is something that you just create from a single stem cell. You don't need anything else. No egg, no sperm, no problem. So this is, now, this hasn't been taken to the stage where anyone's actually made a human being, because there are ethical problems here, and it hasn't been done. But I mean, it's just a matter of, I mean, you could do it, I think, anytime you wanted to. It's just a matter of biochemistry, right? And so I think this is on the cards. And then you can take you know, these individual human organoids that you can make, and you can put like blood vessels in them. Then you can put these things on little microchips that you can see down in the left here. And so gradually you can produce very sophisticated tissues for doing research on human tissues, right? That don't rely on animals anymore. And that's very important because genetically, for one thing, there are very important differences between humans and animals, which are very important when you're trying to translate animal results to humans. And there are, in fact, these days, a whole raft of techniques which are human-centric, where you don't need animals. So you can do a lot of gene sequencing, genetics on humans. This, you know, picture I put up here, which looks like something that Kandinsky might have painted, is just a picture of somebody has taken tissues from a human, and they've actually sequenced the messenger RNA in every single cell of this organism, and then you can see that these cells form different groups, and this tells you certain things about, you know, gene expression in these various tissues, and that can be done on humans. And there are also the kinds of imaging where non-invasively you can use things like MRI to look at the activities of different human organs without actually doing anything invasive. So with all this genetics, with all this stem cells, with all this imaging, you really don't have to use human tissues anymore, more and more. It's becoming less and less, use animal tissues anymore. It's becoming less and less reasonable to use them. You don't need to, you can use human tissues. And that's a fantastic advance in science, actually. So just for a moment, let's consider the pharmaceutical companies. So pharmaceutical companies have to do all these horrible tests on animals for safety reasons. Yeah? And a large part of the 1 gazillion animals that are used every year are put to death in pharmaceutical companies because they have to have, you know, drugs and things and procedures tested upon them, which, you know, there are reasons in the law for doing this that we could talk about, but you certainly have to do it. But these tests don't work very well either. And increasingly, there's a realization of that you could use organs on a chip based on human stem cell technology and things like that, which means that you don't have to use animals anymore. And very recently, the law in America, the Federal Drug Administration, made an enormous change. Previously, if you want to bring a drug to market in the United States and in Europe, you had to present to the ruling body, the FDA in America, you know, experimental results showing that they did what you said and they were safe. And these had to be results, for the most part, based on animal research as well as clinical trials on humans. But they've just passed a law now saying you don't have to do that anymore, and they will accept completely, you know, stem cell and other human-based technologies, and you don't actually need to use animal research anymore. Now, the FDA are a pretty conservative organization, so for them to say that is, I think, pretty remarkable. And here's an interesting quote that I'll finish off with. You know, we've just gone through COVID, and one of the incredible scientific achievements, I think, was how rapidly the world responded in producing a vaccine for the COVID virus. It was really quick. It was quite something. At warp speed is what they said. But here's what Moderna, who made one of the first vaccines, said about it. He said, I don't think proving this, the vaccine's effectiveness, in an animal model is on the critical path to getting this to a clinical trial. And this is when the world is faced, you know, with a tremendous problem. And in fact, animals weren't really used very much at all to produce these very important vaccines. So let me finish then by saying that, you know, animal research has a very interesting history. And these days, I think that we need to do it less and less. The future of research, of biomedical research, is not with animals, it is with human-based experiments. And this is coming down the pipe very quickly. And I don't think in, I don't know how many years, 5, 10, I don't know, not too far in the future, there won't be any more animal research at all. So how exactly long will it take? You know, I mean, people who are doing, you know, these kinds of experiments at the moment and whose careers are built upon them are not going to like just stop doing them tomorrow. That's unreasonable. So I mean, there's this interesting quote by Max Planck, who was one of the great scientists of the 19th century, who said, "Science advances one funeral at a time." So I think that just about tells you about how long it will take. Okay, thank you very much indeed.